A single spark. That's all it ever takes. High above the Nevada desert, moonlight glinted coldly off scorched metal and charred paint. The remains of luxury twisted into nightmare. Smoke billowed from a battered aircraft, engines screaming their final protest against gravity itself. Inside, chaos reigned. Fear tightened every throat. Betrayal simmered behind desperate eyes, and trust lay shattered like broken glass underfoot. Outside, the dark waited patiently, a silent predator hidden in shadows, armed and ruthless. Secrets too dangerous for daylight clawed at the metal skin, desperate to escape. Every heartbeat drummed a warning catastrophe lingered only a breath away. Tonight, in a forgotten corner of America's endless desert, lines between hero and villain would blur, because some truths cannot stay buried, no matter how deep the grave or how deadly the cost. Nick West stood beneath the flickering overhead light in the main hangar of Arden Field, trying to steady his breathing. It was well past sundown, and the cavernous space seemed almost haunted by the silhouettes of old aircraft tails and the quiet drip of condensed humidity. He fiddled with a battered wrench from his father's old metal toolbox, the inherited relic that bore the faded initials G.W. for Graham West, Nick's late father. The hum of a small desk fan nearby was the only sound other than Nick's own heartbeat. Years ago, he had dreamed of working in advanced aeronautics, perhaps even going to engineering school. Life, however, had taken an unexpected path, starting with his father's tragic death under circumstances that never fully made sense. Now 48 and worn by time, Nick was the resident mechanic at a little-known airstrip that scarcely saw any planes bigger than a local crop duster or a two-seater for weekend hobby pilots. Arden Field rested in the southwestern desert region of California, an area typically overlooked by big corporations. Yet for several months now, rumors had circulated that Apex Aero, a vast aerospace and defense conglomerate, planned to buy up small airports like this, presumably to turn them into drone test sites or specialized private airfields. Nick tried not to pay much attention to rumors, but everyone else around here did. The fear of losing one's livelihood had seeped into the local coffee shop conversations, the late-night bar hush, and the quiet glances from staff who saw him as the last line of defense. Still, Nick found some comfort in his daily habits: the metallic smell of engine oil, the gentle swirl of dust on the hangar floor, and the distant, reassuring hum of a night watch radio. It was a routine existence, and he found solace in it until that night, when the squeal of tires and the crackle of radio static shattered his calm. A security officer named Doyle came rushing toward him, shouting that an unidentified jet was requesting an emergency landing. It made no sense. Arden Field rarely saw any large traffic, let alone something that needed urgent clearance to land. Nick's chest tightened with apprehension. Within minutes, he was sprinting across the dimly lit tarmac, toolbox rattling against his thigh, flashlight beam dancing over cracked asphalt. The radio chatter was urgent. The approaching aircraft had declared a partial electrical failure at high altitude, and the pilot required immediate permission to land. Nick peered into the night sky, uncertain of the silhouette he would see. A distant roar grew louder, vibrating through his ribcage, until the shape emerged from the darkness, a sleek, ominous-looking Gulfstream G700. For a split second, Nick hesitated. This was not the battered prop planes he usually patched up. This was a top-tier private jet that must have cost tens of millions of dollars, maybe more. The plane touched down with a screech, creating sparks beneath the landing gear. Nick hurried to its side, adrenaline spiking at the possibility of lethal damage or hidden flames. The cabin door hissed open, and descending the steps was a tall woman in a tailored jacket, her features etched with concern. She introduced herself in a clipped, professional tone as Vanessa Caldwell, CEO of Apex Aero. Nick's mind spun with confusion and alarm. The very corporation rumored to be swallowing up small airports was now on his turf, with an aircraft that desperately needed repairs. He crouched by the left wing, noticing an unusual panel design that confirmed advanced modifications. Something about this was off, and he could feel it in his gut. What was a CEO like her doing landing here? Of all places, especially in the middle of the night? And why did it feel like the plane was deliberately brought to Ardenfield? Nick's initial shock gave way to methodical focus as Vanessa Caldwell wasted no time demanding a quick technical rundown. She spoke in clipped phrases, exuding calm authority. She explained that their flight from New York to an undisclosed location was forced into an emergency route due to an electrical system alert that threatened to knock out the jet's navigation. On the tarmac, wind whipped sand against Nick's ankles, adding to the tension. He could see that Vanessa was accompanied by two men. One introduced himself as Maxwell Drake, the aircraft's pilot, and the other, wearing a dark suit and an earpiece, hovered protectively without giving a name. Nick suspected he was some form of security or corporate enforcer. As they approached the main hangar, Vanessa requested a private space for the jet's immediate inspection. Nick motioned to the only covered facility large enough to accommodate something this size. Dust covered the old structure, and overhead lights flickered uncertainly. Inside, he guided them to a corner that housed basic diagnostic machinery, little more than an outdated power scope and a fuel gauge system. Nothing advanced enough to troubleshoot the complexities of a top-tier private jet's electronics. Yet, he'd have to make do. He cracked the first panels under the cockpit and, by flashlight, began scanning the wiring harnesses. Right away, he noticed a mismatch in the color coding, as though the plane's original schematics had been altered. If you were trying to fix a standard G700, you'd be at a loss. This looked almost custom, reminiscent of advanced military or research wiring Nick had glimpsed during his brief stint in the Air Force 2 decades ago. And that memory stung. It was there that he had lost his father, Graham West, under suspicious circumstances rumored to involve testing dangerous new aerospace technology. Nick had walked away from that world, but the hints of it still haunted him. Vanessa hovered, her eyes sharp. She demanded an immediate estimate on how long repairs would take. Nick tried to keep his voice steady. He explained that with standard spares, a typical fix might be a few hours. However, given the modifications, it could be days. He'd need specialized parts and advanced software diagnostics. She frowned. Days were too long. She said, Apex Aero had crucial business to attend to. The next flight had to happen soon. If Nick cooperated, they'd pay him handsomely. If not, she hinted, they'd quickly source someone else, even if that meant relocating the entire plane to a bigger facility. Despite her tone, Nick picked up an undercurrent of something else: urgency, perhaps desperation. It wasn't just about money or schedule. He sensed that Vanessa was hiding something about the purpose of this plane and why its systems were so non-standard. But with no time for deeper questions, Nick resolved to do the best he could. If he was going to save Arden Field from corporate takeover, or at least secure it a decent future, he needed to cooperate. Maybe, too, he might unearth the truth about Apex Aero's rumored expansions and see if the rumors were real. As Vanessa strolled off to take a phone call, Nick paused for a breather. The night's tension weighed on him. He gently placed his father's toolbox on a nearby bench, letting his thoughts wander to Graham West. If Dad were here, he'd probably say, never fix what you don't understand, learn it first. Nick exhaled. He would figure out these bizarre modifications. No matter how classified they appeared, he would gather every clue, every sign that pointed towards something bigger. Because this wasn't just about repairing an airplane. It felt like he was stepping onto a stage where forces far greater than a broken fuse or a faulty wire were at play. By the time Nick started systematically testing the G700's primary electrical modules, the clock read nearly 2 a.m. He'd barely noticed how fast the hours passed. Vanessa and her entourage had retreated to the small staff lounge to make calls, leaving him undisturbed. A lone overhead bulb cast spidery shadows on the hangar wall, and the heavy hush of early morning intensified the echoes of his own movements. His first step was to hook up the plane's system to the archaic diagnostic machine, but the readouts were contradictory. Several segments of the plane's power distribution grid seemed to be pulling more voltage than any normal G700 system required. Something had clearly been installed that demanded significantly higher energy, exactly the sort of custom job that spelled military-grade technology to Nick. At one point, The hangar's side door slammed open, letting in a gust of desert wind and a swirl of sand. Nick looked up, expecting it might be Vanessa returning, but instead saw Doyle, the night security guard. Doyle's eyes were wide, and he was breathing heavily as though he'd run all the way from the main gate. "Nick," he said, voice trembling, "you'd better come see this," without any explanation. Doyle grabbed him by the wrist and practically dragged him outside. They went around to the far end of the hangar, where a single flickering floodlight revealed a set of fresh tire tracks on the dusty perimeter road. "What's going on?" Nick asked, exasperated. Doyle stammered out that he had seen a black SUV parked just beyond the fence line, someone inside with a long-range camera lens pointed at the Gulf Stream. When Doyle approached, the vehicle sped off, but not before he caught a glimpse of government plates. Nick's mind jumped to a chilling thought. Was the plane under surveillance by a federal agency, or perhaps a rival defense contractor? The presence of a suspicious observer suggested that whatever was happening inside that jet was worth watching, maybe worth stealing, or worth silencing. Returning inside, Nick found himself even more determined to glean the truth. He studied the plane's interior layout using a handheld digital blueprint device that Maxwell Drake, the pilot, had reluctantly shared. Certain sections were locked behind passcodes, presumably top secret. Nick could only see the basic skeleton enough to identify that the craft carried an advanced secondary power system possibly meant to energize some form of high-tech sensor array or weapon. The puzzle pieces weren't fitting neatly yet, but each new clue made the bigger picture more ominous. Finally, he reached a hidden compartment near the tail, paneling that was flush and nearly invisible. Using a borrowed multi-tool, he pried it open with caution. Inside was a partial circuit board far more sophisticated than anything civilian. Wires led to a black box marked only with a cryptic white label, Vanguard Prototype 21. Nick's heart kicked up a notch. He had heard of Vanguard before in hushed conversations during his Air Force days. It was rumored to be a next-generation energy system that had proven too dangerous for wide-scale deployment. Leaning closer, he found the entire compartment lined with a protective metal that prevented electronic eavesdropping. This was no routine emergency. As curiosity grew, so did a faint dread in the pit of his stomach. Something big was going on, and he was right in the middle of it. The next morning's early rays filtered through the dusty upper windows of the hangar, illuminating the Gulf Stream's sleek fuselage like a prized artifact in a museum exhibit. Nick had only dozed off for an hour, slumped in a swivel chair near his makeshift work table, but his mind buzzed with unanswered questions. He considered confronting Vanessa Caldwell directly about Vanguard Prototype 21, but a part of him suspected that might put him at risk. Instead, he resolved to gather more intel first, aware that a naive confrontation could lead to her simply flying out, leaving him none the wiser. Besides, he still owed it to the local folks at Arden Field to keep track of what Apex Aero was up to. Around 6 a.m., Vanessa appeared, looking surprisingly refreshed. She wore a crisp blouse and had the manner of someone used to controlling entire boardrooms. Nick watched her stride across the hangar floor, her expression a combination of impatience and calculation. She offered him a curt nod and asked if there was progress to report. Nick gave her the simplified version. It was an electrical cascade fault triggered by an overtaxed power distribution unit, apparently due to some specialized hardware never meant for a civilian jet. Vanessa's lips tightened, and Nick couldn't tell if she was relieved or annoyed. Before Nick could inquire further, a commotion near the main entrance caught their attention. Two uniformed men, airport staff, who seldom had anything to do beyond fueling planes, stumbled inside, shouting about a break-in at the old storage hangar. Nick and Vanessa exchanged alarmed glances and hurried over. The storage hangar held decades' worth of rusted parts and vintage aviation memorabilia, including some of Nick's father's old engineering notes. Upon arriving, they found the lock jimmied open, scattered boxes, and footprints in the dust. One of the staff insisted they saw a hooded figure fleeing moments earlier. When Nick inspected the aftermath, a chill prickled along his spine. The rummaged boxes included a small collection of Graham West's personal journals, documents that Nick had never fully explored. They were possibly connected to the secret projects his father once worked on, projects that rumor said had led to his accidental death. The intruder seemed to have singled out these exact items. Most of the notes were still there, but some crucial pages, blueprints, sketched in his father's distinctive handwriting were missing. Feeling unsettled, Nick turned to Vanessa and demanded answers. "Look," he said, voice tense. "I don't know what game Apex Arrow is playing, but something in that jet is connected to the research my father was part of. Now someone's breaking in to steal his journals. If you know anything about this, I need the truth." Vanessa's demeanor softened. Just a fraction. She admitted that she recognized Graham West's name from decades-old files at Apex Arrow. "Your father's work was significant," she said quietly. "Too significant for the time. Our company, under a different name back then, collaborated with him before a major incident." She said no more, but her eyes flickered with genuine unease. Nick's stomach churned. He realized that the threads of his father's past and this mysterious aircraft were interwoven in a much larger tapestry of secrecy. To get real answers, he might have to keep playing along with Vanessa, even if it meant walking on a razor's edge of corporate secrets, possible espionage, and a brewing confrontation between powerful interests. Meanwhile, the missing pages from his father's journals hinted that others were actively seeking the same knowledge, and they were willing to steal, or worse, to get it. By midday, the desert sun had turned Ardenfield's asphalt into a shimmering griddle, the heat waves rippling across the runway. Nick retreated to a cramped office behind the hangar to comb through what remained of his father's journals. The half-intact references to Vanguard and Project Ares took on sudden, dire meaning. They connected a covert energy system with high potential for misuse. His father had warned of a chain reaction risk if these designs were implemented improperly. Now, seeing the partial modifications in the Gulf Stream, Nick suspected someone had resurrected that same design. He spent the next few hours scanning every page, making a mental map of how Project Ares might tie into the jet's custom wiring. More than once, he paused to recall the day he learned of his father's death. The Air Force had simply informed him it was a test flight gone wrong, engine failure over the southwestern desert. But rumors soon swirled that Graham West had objected to pushing a prototype system to dangerous extremes. The heartbreak and confusion had led Nick to leave the military not long after, vowing never to let classified technology overshadow moral judgment. Now it seemed fate was giving him a second chance to expose the truth. Exhausted yet determined, Nick reemerged into the hangar. He locked eyes with Maxwell Drake, the pilot, who had been leaning against a tool chest as if waiting for him. The pilot motioned him aside, casting a nervous glance to ensure they weren't overheard. In hushed tones, Drake admitted that he'd known from the start something was off with the plane's retrofits. He claimed he was just a pilot following orders, but the flight logs had shown unusual patterns, long ascents at altitudes typically reserved for testing high-energy payloads. Drake swore he wanted no part in covert military ops. He had a family, kids in high school, and simply needed a paycheck. Nick probed him about Vanessa Caldwell. Drake's gaze flickered with uncertainty. He believed Caldwell was taking her own risk, that she wasn't fully aligned with Apex Arrow's upper echelons. "Word is," Drake said, "she's under pressure from the board to prove that repurposing old black book tech can revolutionize modern aerospace. She might be in over her head." Nick wanted to believe that, but he'd have to see evidence before placing trust in her or Drake. Just then, an ear-splitting alarm resounded across the field, the echo of a security klaxon. Over the loudspeaker, someone announced an unauthorized aircraft was approaching. Nick and Drake dashed to the outdoor platform, straining their eyes at the horizon. A dark helicopter buzzed into view, unmarked and menacing. It circled once around the Gulf Stream, as though surveying the scene. Then, in a disquieting display, the chopper hovered momentarily before speeding away. In that brief pass, Nick glimpsed a silhouette leaning out the side door, camera pointed downward. It reminded him of the black SUV from the night before. His stomach churned. These watchers were not giving up. Within moments, Vanessa Caldwell emerged, hair disheveled as if she'd been running. She asked Nick if he recognized the chopper. He shook his head but sensed that a confrontation was looming. Every passing hour made it clearer that multiple factions, perhaps government, Perhaps corporate rivals were circling this remote airfield like sharks scenting blood. If this was about resurrecting a dangerous project his father once tried to stop, Nick feared the cost could be far greater than losing the airport. There might be lives on the line. Later that afternoon, Nick managed to steal a quiet half hour to do a thorough inventory of the specialized gear attached to the G700. With Maxwell Drake's discreet help, they opened compartments typically locked behind biometric security, bypassed only because Drake offered his pilot's override. Inside, Nick found a labyrinth of cables feeding into a device that looked suspiciously like an energy amplifier, something that could channel and boost electrical power beyond normal thresholds. Coupled with the references to Vanguard and his father's Project Ares, the evidence was unmistakable. This plane carried a functional prototype designed to push boundaries of electrical conduction, perhaps even beam power to other craft or ground stations. In the wrong hands, or if used recklessly, it could result in catastrophic accidents, overloads, explosions, widespread blackouts, or worse. The notion that Apex Aero might be seeking a commercial or military advantage with it turned Nick's stomach. Yet a nagging question remained, why bring this plane, in near-failure condition, to a remote field? Why risk an emergency landing that drew local attention? As Nick contemplated the possibilities, he heard the sound of footsteps on the hangar's metal flooring. Vanessa Caldwell stood there, arms folded, her normally steely expression softened. She asked if he'd discovered anything unusual. Nick took a measured breath, deciding to confront her with partial honesty. He told her he recognized a power amplifier system that echoed his father's old designs. He also mentioned the break-in targeting those designs. Calmly but firmly, he pressed, why come here? Why not land in a bigger facility with better resources? Vanessa exhaled, leaning against a crate of spare parts. After a tense pause, she revealed a fragment of her motivations. She confessed that after repeated malfunctions in flight, she overrode the pilot's suggestion to divert to a major airport because she knew the big hubs were monitored by both corporate rivals and certain government agencies. She'd heard rumors of Nick West, a gifted mechanic with a background in Air Force engineering, rumored to be untouchable by major corporations due to his father's legacy. So yes, she orchestrated the landing, hoping to fix the plane quietly and continue her mission before anyone else caught wind. Nick's eyebrows rose. He asked about the mission, but Vanessa avoided specifics, only hinting that she and a handful of allies in Apex Aero wanted to refine the technology responsibly. She claimed the real threat was from a rival faction within the company, people who'd see no limits on how far they'd push or how dangerously they'd deploy it. If they succeed, she said softly, it makes old nuclear deterrence look almost quaint by comparison. Nick felt a swirl of emotions. On one hand, her partial admission was more than he expected. On the other, it was hardly a full confession. Part of him empathized with her predicament, recalling how his father had tried to slow the military's rush into untested extremes. But the memory of the suspicious break-in and the helicopter watchers warned him not to trust too easily. Before he could press further, Doyle's voice echoed from the hangar entrance. Someone from the local sheriff's office was here, demanding to speak with them about suspicious activity. Time was running short. Nick and Vanessa exchanged a tense glance. Whether they liked it or not, they were in this together, tangled in a high-stakes race that neither fully understood, with powerful forces closing in from all sides. Sheriff Bill Hinckley stood near the office doorway, his broad frame blocking most of the midday sun as he peered suspiciously at Nick and Vanessa. Nick had known Hinckley for years, though not closely. The sheriff was more accustomed to dealing with petty theft and the occasional dust-up at the local bar than with potential espionage or advanced aerospace conspiracies. Still, the older man radiated a no-nonsense authority, and Nick could see he was already on edge. Got some reports, Hinckley began, voice gruff, about break-ins, black SUVs, and a fancy jet nobody around here has ever seen. Care to explain why half my county is spooked? Vanessa stepped forward to provide a sanitized explanation. Her plane experienced a critical electrical issue, forced to land at Arden Field, and security measures might have drawn unwanted attention. The sheriff gave her a long, discerning stare. It was clear he didn't entirely buy it, especially since she was reluctant to provide details about her corporate background. Nick offered a bit more, mentioning the discovered footprints at the storage hangar and the suspicious helicopter. Hinckley listened, then rubbed his temples as if a migraine was forming. "Look, West," he said, finally addressing Nick. "I don't know what's really going on, but if your father's old archives are involved, it can't be simple. I'd prefer you keep me in the loop. We don't need chaos out here." He gave a pointed glance at Vanessa, who just pressed her lips together, then with a cautionary warning for them to call if anything else turned up. The sheriff strode off, leaving behind a tension-laden silence. As soon as Hinckley was out of earshot, Vanessa exhaled an audible sigh. She turned to Nick, about to speak, but was cut off by a sudden burst of shouting from outside. They rushed to the front of the hangar to find Maxwell Drake on the ground, clutching his head in pain, while a masked figure stood over him, a figure dressed in dark tactical clothing, holding what looked like a collapsible baton. In that instant, time seemed to slow. Nick's adrenaline spiked. He launched himself forward without thinking, tackling the intruder in a wild flurry of limbs. The scuffle was short and fierce. The masked assailant, surprisingly skilled, landed a kick to Nick's side, nearly winding him, but Nick had leverage from years of physical labor. He gripped the intruder's arm, slamming it into the tarmac until the baton clattered away. Vanessa shouted for security, but the intruder managed to break free, sprinting off across the runway. Doyle, the guard, gave chase with a stunned expression, but the assailant vaulted a low fence and disappeared into the dusty expanse beyond. Nick rolled onto his back, ribs aching, trying to catch his breath. Drake was bruised but conscious, shaken up. Vanessa hurried over, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. This was no ordinary break-in. They'd just been assaulted in broad daylight with a direct attempt to incapacitate or maybe interrogate the pilot. Nick could only guess that the attacker wanted something they believed Drake possessed: flight codes, data logs, or the plane itself. In the aftermath, Nick helped Drake to a makeshift first aid station inside the hangar. While cleaning a cut on Drake's temple, Nick noticed the pilot's eyes were haunted. "I think they said something," Drake muttered, voice trembling. They whispered, "Give us the blueprint." Nick's heart pounded. This had to connect with the stolen pages from his father's journal. With a grim set to his jaw, Nick realized that every minute they spent here raised the danger level. They had to fortify the plane, finalize repairs, and figure out who else might come after them. Meanwhile, the name Blueprint hung heavy in the air. Someone wanted the knowledge that Graham West had died trying to protect. By late afternoon, Nick found himself rummaging in a back storage cabinet for extra cable harnesses to patch the G700's compromised lines. Every movement sent a twinge of pain through his torso from the fight earlier. As he gingerly tested a coil of wire, a distant voice called his name. It was Doyle, pointing to a far corner of the hangar where a small office door stood ajar. "Someone's been in there," Doyle shouted, face pale. Nick hurried over, nerves on high alert. That old office once served as a workshop for his father, though it had sat mostly unused in recent years. Inside, dusty boxes were shoved aside, old schematic drawings scattered across the floor. A faint smell of stale cigarettes lingered in the air, suggesting an intruder had just been there. Nick's gaze fell on a large blueprint pinned crookedly to the wall, a detailed diagram of a theoretical power amplifier that matched the partial pages missing from his father's journal. This one, however, seemed more complete, annotated with notes in Graham West's handwriting. As Nick carefully lifted the edge of the blueprint to inspect the notations, a slip of paper fluttered out. Written in his father's neat script, it read, "Chain reaction, risk variation, potential meltdown if forced to operate above recommended thresholds. Seek safer alternatives." A lump formed in Nick's throat. This was the clearest sign yet that his father had tried to create contingency plans, possibly a safer route to harness the technology. Why had these warnings been suppressed, and who was raiding the place, desperately searching for them? He stepped back, scanning the disheveled office. Memories flooded him. A younger Nick, barely 20, stepping in here to ask his dad about flight mechanics. Graham West often said, "A proper engineer thinks about the fail states first." Nick, "A plane only truly works if you know how it breaks." Now, son, he realized how relevant those words were to the lethal system inside that Gulf Stream. If the blueprint indicated meltdown potential, it might be a bigger threat than anyone realized. Soon, Vanessa and Maxwell Drake arrived, guided by Doyle. When Vanessa saw the blueprint, her eyes widened. She muttered something about how the system looked close to the Vanguard concept she'd seen in old, classified company archives. Nick confronted her, pointing to the meltdown notes. "This is not safe," he insisted, "and it's not stable. If your people at Apex Aero want to push it, they're flirting with disaster." Vanessa, her face grim, nodded. She admitted she'd suspected the technology had hidden pitfalls. "I've tried to push for more oversight, more caution," she said, her tone uncertain. "But there are higher-ups who only see the potential profit or military edge." Maxwell Drake's expression darkened. He said in a shaky voice, "Are we dealing with a weapon, something that can blow up?" Nick looked to the blueprint's meltdown warnings. "Potentially, yes, if they push it too hard." The pilot paled, glancing from Nick to Vanessa. Meanwhile, Nick noticed the chill in Vanessa's demeanor. She seemed torn loyal to her position at Apex Aero, yet visibly troubled that this technology might cause catastrophe. Gathering the blueprint and the note from his father, Nick pressed them into a secure folder. He turned to Vanessa. "If you're serious about doing the right thing," he said, "we need to confront whoever's behind these expansions. We need to ensure this plane cannot be weaponized." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. The sunlight filtering through a dusty window cast an almost sepia glow, like a scene from an old war photograph. Nick sensed a pivotal shift. If they couldn't shut this down or control it, any illusions of a safe resolution might dissolve under the weight of powerful corporate agendas. And the next time an intruder showed up, it might not end in a mere scuffle. Twilight set in, painting the horizon a bruised purple. Nick, Vanessa, and Maxwell Drake huddled around a rickety wooden table inside the hangar, where Nick had laid out several key documents in a neat array. On top was the newly recovered blueprint from Graham West, marked with meltdown risk notes. Next to it were partial system diagrams from the G700 itself, gleaned from Drake's pilot access codes and Nick's own hands-on inspections. Finally, there was a laptop containing the plane's flight logs and sensor data files that Drake provided, albeit nervously, after he was certain none of his superiors would find out. Vanessa cleared her throat, posture stiff, and began explaining. She confirmed that the power amplifier on board was indeed derived from an old project, something Apex Aero had inherited when it acquired a smaller firm decades ago. The acquisition included incomplete patents, rumored to be from Graham West's collaboration with the Air Force. The company rebranded the concept as Vanguard, intending to refine it for commercial energy transmission or possibly for cutting-edge propulsion. But soon after initial trials, the project was declared too volatile. A meltdown scenario could spark uncontrollable chain reactions, though no official details were ever made public. Nick, scanning the flight logs, noticed repeated high-altitude tests, each flight pushing the system beyond recommended parameters. "You see here," he pointed to columns of raw data. "They're testing extended output for too long. The meltdown threshold is creeping closer." Maxwell Drake paled. He swore he hadn't known the extent of these tests. He'd simply followed flight profiles from the company's R&D department. "Why risk such extremes?" he muttered. "It's like they're trying to weaponize it, or at least prove it can be." Vanessa sighed, massaging her temples. "From what I gather, a faction in Apex Aero believes if we can harness stable, high-output energy on a plane, it's a game-changer. It could power advanced drones, next-gen lasers, or stealth systems. They want to be first, no matter the risk." She paused, then added, "I was tasked with demonstrating the system's viability, but I never agreed to push it past safety protocols. That's why I demanded we land here." I had to find someone off the corporate radar to fix the meltdown issues quietly. Nick gritted his teeth. The memory of his father's suspicious death churned in his mind. Graham West's cautionary stance had cost him his life, or so the rumors went. Nick was determined not to let that cycle repeat, but the entire scenario felt like a powder keg. If a big chunk of the company or shadowy military interests were backing the project, he might be facing more than corporate suits, armed operatives. Intelligence agencies, or mercenaries could all be in play. He proposed a risky plan: strip out or sabotage the critical meltdown trigger within the plane's amplifier system, rendering it harmless if they tried to push it too far. In essence, an internal kill switch. Maxwell Drake was hesitant. If discovered, he could lose his job, possibly face legal action. Vanessa, however, seemed open to the idea, though reluctant. "It's our best bet," Nick insisted, tapping the meltdown caution notes. "People are already coming after these files. We either disable the system or let a ticking time bomb fly out of here." The trio exchanged guarded but resolute glances. With the desert night deepening around them, they understood the time for half measures had passed. The immediate threat of break-ins and masked attackers might pale in comparison to what would happen if the plane left Arden Field still armed with a potential doomsday device. Nick vowed to see this through, for his father's legacy and for the safety of everyone in that plane's path, whether friend or foe. The next steps, however, would require absolute secrecy and nerves of steel. An hour later, after a hurried meal of lukewarm takeout from the lone diner still open in the area, Nick armed himself with tools, schematics, and a steely determination. While Maxwell Drake diverted the few airport staff with talk of routine maintenance, Nick and Vanessa slipped back into the Gulfstream, flashlight beams dancing across the polished surfaces and advanced avionics panels. The plan was straightforward but perilous. Locate the power modulator core inside the amplifier system, then install a failsafe that would trip if the system exceeded safe levels. As they worked, sweat beaded on Nick's forehead. The inside of the Gulfstream's electronics bay was cramped, hot, and layered with unfamiliar hardware. Vanessa, kneeling beside him, had some knowledge of the system's design but still struggled with its labyrinthine tangle of wires. At one point, she glanced at him, eyes reflecting a swirl of guilt and resolve. "I never wanted to become part of corporate sabotage," she whispered. "But if they knew what we're doing—" Nick cut her off gently. "If we don't do this, people could die, or a city block might vanish in a meltdown. We can't let that happen." He recalled an old memory, his father once telling him that real courage isn't about patriotism or blind obedience. It's about knowing when to stand up to those pushing you to do the wrong thing. With a shaky exhale, Nick sliced through a protective sleeve of wiring, revealing the amplifier's gleaming core. He attached a small bridging circuit that would detect excessive current flow and instantly shunt it into a bypass, effectively frying the system if it ever tried to go into meltdown territory. During this delicate procedure, the plane's interior lighting suddenly flickered. Nick froze, glancing toward Vanessa. She tapped her phone, no signal. A high-pitched whine echoed from somewhere near the cargo hold. Fearing another intruder, Nick signaled for silence. They inched cautiously toward the rear, flashlights off. In the dim corridors of the plane, every footstep felt deafening. Then they heard it clearly, a scraping sound, like metal on metal, followed by a faint beep. Nick held up a wrench as an impromptu weapon, while Vanessa found a small fire extinguisher. They crept toward the cargo area, hearts pounding. The whine stopped, replaced by a tense silence. Nick flicked his flashlight on in a sudden burst, illuminating empty cargo netting and storage bins. No person in sight. But the floor hatch that led to the plane's undercarriage was slightly ajar. He mustered the courage to yank it open. Within lay a cramped maintenance space, cables coiled along the walls. A fleeting glimpse of movement, then darkness. Someone had been there, possibly tampering with the same system they were trying to fix. Nick slammed the hatch shut and locked it, adrenaline surging. "They're one step ahead or behind us," Vanessa rasped. "We can't stay in here." Nick agreed. The plane was compromised. They retreated to the main cabin and quickly verified that their sabotage was still intact. Thankfully, the kill switch remained in place, but if an unknown operative was lurking around, they might attempt to remove or alter it. Gathering their tools, they ducked out of the Gulf Stream, hearts still hammering. Maxwell Drake met them on the hangar floor, alarmed at their expressions. Nick recounted the intrusion. Drake paled, wiping his brow with a shaky hand. If the intruder was from the same faction that attacked him earlier, they weren't going to let the plane get away easily. That left Nick and Vanessa with a pressing question. Should they keep working in secret or call for help from the authorities? But if they did the latter, they risked tipping off powerful players within Apex Aero or the government. They were cornered, and the stakes were multiplying by the hour. Night settled like an oppressive shroud, and the wind that swept the airfield carried the scent of impending storms. Nick gathered those he trusted: Vanessa Caldwell, Maxwell Drake, Doyle the guard, and a few local staff who had been at Arden Field for years and weren't likely to be bribed or intimidated by outsiders. They convened in a dimly lit corner of the hangar, the overhead lamp flickering like a nervous heartbeat. Nick laid it all out. The plane's advanced amplifier was dangerously unstable. Powerful entities were circling, prepared to do anything to seize or sabotage the tech. They'd already endured massed assailants, thefts, and suspicious break-ins. The group listened, expressions grim. Doyle in particular seemed frightened but resolute. He'd known Nick since childhood and recalled how Graham West had quietly protected the community from reckless experiments once before. If Nick was stepping up to do the same, Doyle would back him. Vanessa took the floor, explaining that she had partial authority at Apex Aero, but another, more aggressive faction existed. They were likely behind the infiltration attempts, and if they discovered that she was cooperating with Nick to cripple the system, they'd act swiftly, either legally or otherwise. She suggested that in the morning, she'd phone a few trusted contacts in Washington who might mediate. Nick responded that any official channels risked tipping off the wrong people. Maxwell Drake fidgeted with the bandage on his forehead, recalling the intruder who'd attacked him. "They're not waiting around," he said, voice shaky. "We might not survive until some bureaucrat decides to help." Silence thickened, and the group considered the possibility of forcibly grounding the plane or even destroying the amplifier. But that action might provoke direct retaliation. Plus, if the plane couldn't fly, the antagonists might descend on Arden Field en masse to retrieve the hardware. It felt like a no-win scenario. Suddenly, a glimmer of an idea sparked in Nick's mind. Could they move the plane out, under the guise of it being fully operational, and lure the pursuing faction into a trap? He proposed it. They'd finish repairing the outward electrical systems so the plane could take off. The hidden kill switch would remain, preventing meltdown. Then they'd pick a location, a neutral Air Force base, or somewhere they had a chance of legal protection, and fly out, drawing the shadowy pursuers away from Arden Field. It was a huge risk, but at least they'd be in motion, not sitting ducks. Vanessa hesitated, her worry for corporate repercussions warring with her moral sense of right and wrong. But Nick's logic was sound. In motion, they'd have fewer vulnerabilities than in a tiny desert airfield. Doyle and the local staff pledged to keep watch overnight, doubling the security around the hangar. Maxwell Drake would rest and prepare for a flight possibly at dawn. Vanessa planned to gather relevant data for an official disclosure if the opportunity arose. Each step, however, was a gamble. "We'll be outmanned and outgunned if they come in force," Doyle cautioned. Nick just nodded. The echoes of his father's final days haunted him, fueling his determination to see this through. If the cost of letting the plane and its dangerous tech remain in the shadows was more lives lost, he'd never forgive himself. So they'd take the fight or flight approach, literally, and hope it didn't end in tragedy. Preparations for the dawn flight began in secrecy during the darkest hours of the night. Nick and Maxwell Drake worked meticulously, attaching fresh wiring harnesses to bypass damaged sections, ensuring that the plane's basic functions, navigation, communications, engine control, would operate smoothly. Meanwhile, the hidden sabotage in the amplifier remained carefully concealed beneath layers of standard wiring. If someone ran a superficial systems check, it would appear normal. Only a deep diagnostic would reveal the kill switch Nick had installed. Throughout the night, the tension was palpable. Doyle and a few others patrolled the perimeter with flashlights, radios crackling in sporadic bursts of static. The local staff, unsettled by the earlier break-ins, tried to maintain their composure. Every so often, a coyote's howl or the scuttle of nocturnal desert creatures made them jump. Nick found himself glancing at the horizon, half expecting to see headlights of an approaching convoy. Inside the cockpit, Drake guided Nick through final checks on the avionics. Their hushed voices mingled with the low hum of electric systems warming up. At one point, Nick paused, leaning back in the co-pilot's seat. "My father used to talk about something like this," he said softly. "He once warned that technology without caution is a loaded gun pointed at the world. I never really believed him until now." Drake nodded solemnly, reluctant to dwell on the moral complexities. He had enough trouble just ensuring they'd survive. Down in the galley, Vanessa Caldwell stared at her phone, frustration evident. She was trying to reach a contact in the Department of Defense, but either got no answer or was stonewalled by front desk protocols. Nick approached, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Even if you reach them, are you sure you can trust them?" he asked quietly. Vanessa's eyes flitted away, uncertainty painting her features. She admitted that not everyone in government was free of corporate influence. The infiltration ran deep. By around 4 a.m., everything was as ready as they could make it. The plan was for Drake to pilot the plane with Vanessa and Nick aboard. Doyle and the local crew would stay behind to guard Arden Field against further intrusion or sabotage. Once airborne, they'd head toward an isolated Air Force base in Nevada, one of the few places with runway capability for the G700 that also had enough neutrality for them to attempt an official handover of the amplifier to secure authorities. If all went well, they'd land, reveal the compromised nature of the system, and force Apex Aero's hidden players into the light. But a gnawing doubt plagued Nick. What if the same faction that had arranged his father's demise still had allies in the military? If so, the neutral base could be a trap. Despite the risks, time was not on their side. With every passing minute, the possibility of another armed attack grew. Their only option was to trust in their combined wits. The kill switch, and a sliver of hope that the world wasn't entirely run by those seeking power at any cost. So they pressed on, hearts pounding with equal measures of fear and determination, anticipating the first rays of dawn that would light their runway and possibly set the stage for a final showdown. At precisely 5:12 a.m., the horizon began to glow, painting the sky with pale orange streaks that promised a scorching day. Nick, Vanessa, and Maxwell Drake aligned themselves near the Gulf Stream, going over final details. Doyle stood guard with an old bolt-action rifle slung over his shoulder, a sentimental relic from his grandfather. But it was better than nothing. A hush settled over the airfield as the engines roared to life. Dust swirled around the taxiway as the plane began to move slowly. Nick felt a surge of adrenaline. He strapped himself into a jump seat behind Drake and Vanessa, who took the pilot and co-pilot positions. Drake was experienced, steady-handed, but Nick could see the tightness in his jaw. Vanessa ran through checklists with mechanical precision. She hadn't slept more than an hour, yet her voice betrayed no fatigue. Over the radio, they heard Doyle's voice runway clear. "Good luck. We'll hold things down here." Nick found a lump in his throat, recalling the camaraderie that had formed in such a short time under such dire circumstances. He prayed none of them would pay a heavy price. The plane rumbled down the runway, engines spooling to full thrust. The takeoff felt both exhilarating and terrifying, ascending into the dawn sky. Nick glimpsed the dusty outlines of Arden Field shrinking behind them. A pang of nostalgia hit him. This was home. But next to that was a fervent hope that if they succeeded, maybe Arden Field could remain just that, unspoiled and safe. Climbing to cruising altitude, Drake set course for the remote Nevada base. Vanessa busied herself verifying that the G700's navigation and communication systems were stable. Nick, though not an official co-pilot, helped interpret sensor data, occasionally checking the amplifier's readouts on a specialized panel. So far, the kill switch was dormant, meaning the system hadn't tried to ramp up dangerously. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew they were dealing with an unpredictable scenario. If someone forced a software override, or if they were intercepted by an unknown aircraft, anything could happen. Half an hour into flight, an unexpected beep sounded from the radar console. Another aircraft had appeared on a direct intercept course, no transponder identification, no radio contact. The color drained from Vanessa's face. "We have company," she whispered, adjusting the radar scope to get a better read. Drake tried to hail them, but there was no response. The unidentified plane was closing the distance fast. Nick felt the plane throttle up slightly as Drake attempted to gain altitude and outrun the bogey. Yet the unidentified craft matched their climb, remaining just a few miles behind, invisible except for a tiny blip on the scope. Without official IFF signals, it could be anything: a hostile fighter, a heavily armed interceptor, or even a stealth test jet from some covert branch of Apex Aero. As tension coiled in the cabin, Nick realized they were pinned in the sky, with nowhere to hide. Suddenly, the G700's control panel flickered. Drake cursed under his breath as a red warning beep sounded from the amplifier system. Nick's blood ran cold. Something or someone was trying to access the plane's advanced power features remotely, forcing it into a higher output. If the kill switch didn't hold, they risked catastrophic meltdown. "They're hacking us," Vanessa hissed, hands flying across the console. Nick scrambled to keep the system stable. The next moments would determine whether they soared or burned. A silent prayer crossed Nick's mind. "Dad, help me see this through." In a desperate bid to maintain control, Nick typed furious commands into the plane's onboard computer, hoping to override the remote hack. Each keystroke felt like a race against meltdown. Meanwhile, Maxwell Drake fought the yoke as the unidentified aircraft closed in behind them. Vanessa Caldwell kept trying to hail the pursuer on every emergency channel. The only reply was static, ominous, silent. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the Gulfstream's engines surged. The cabin lights flickered. Drake shouted that the power output was spiking, pushing the turbines beyond their normal operating range. "They're funneling extra energy into the engines," Nick muttered, fear coiling in his stomach. "We could blow out the turbines or incinerate the whole power system." This was precisely the meltdown scenario Graham West had warned about. The kill switch was designed to blow the amplifier if the threshold was breached. But if the meltdown happened too quickly, it might not matter. As if to confirm Nick's worst thoughts, a new alarm clamored. The autopilot froze, locked by remote commands. Suddenly, the plane lurched, and the nose dipped sharply. Drake cursed, wrestling with manual override. He managed to steady them at the last second, but the G700's sleek interior filled with the stench of burning electronics. Nick realized the sabotage from earlier. The intruder who tampered with the cargo hold might have placed a secondary device or software exploit. "Vanessa," Nick barked, "cut the main data line to the amplifier." "Do it now." She hesitated only a fraction, then physically yanked a breaker switch, hoping it would sever the link. The plane jolted again, but the meltdown alarms dimmed. Slowly, the thrumming noise in the cabin subsided. Nick exhaled in relief, at least momentarily. Drake managed to regain partial manual control. They were still airborne, but the radio crackled with warning signals. Nick prayed they weren't about to lose all engine power. The damage to the system might be critical. Just when they thought they had a reprieve, the radar console blinked again. The unknown aircraft was now dangerously close, less than a mile behind and slightly below, as if positioning for a forced landing or a shoot-down. A chilling beep indicated their plane was being painted with a targeting radar. Nick's heart hammered. Were they about to be shot out of the sky over the roar of engines? Vanessa's voice cut through, sounding calmer than Nick felt. "We still have partial communications. I'll broadcast on the open channel." She flipped a switch and delivered a sharp but clear message. "Unidentified aircraft on our 6. This is Apex Aeroflight requesting stand down. We have a compromised system. Any aggressive move could cause a catastrophic event. Respond immediately." No reply came, but the targeting beep halted, as though the mystery aircraft was reassessing. Drake seized the chance to veer slightly off course, descending toward lower altitude in hopes the pursuer might back off. The G700 shook violently in the process, systems half-fried by the hack attempt. If this were a dogfight, Nick knew they stood no chance. They were outmatched by any advanced fighter or intercept craft. In the tense moments that followed, the plane's instrumentation stabilized just enough for Drake to control it safely. The meltdown alarm was silent, presumably because the kill switch had triggered a partial shutdown. Nick realized with dawning clarity that they were flying on borrowed time. If the other plane attacked, or if the hack resumed, they might not recover a second time. With the Nevada base still some distance away, they had to figure out how to evade or negotiate. Nick glanced at Vanessa, her face pale but resolute. The lines had been drawn. They either succeeded in landing safely and exposing this covert technology, or they might vanish in the desert sky without a trace. Drake guided the battered Gulfstream toward the next viable airstrip, a small civilian airport near the Nevada border. Their original plan to reach the remote Air Force base seemed impossible with a hostile craft on their tail and half their systems fried. Nick's gaze locked onto the radar. Although the unidentified plane still tailed them, it wasn't closing further. Maybe their aggressors feared that forcing them down abruptly could trigger the meltdown they had nearly unleashed. While Drake radioed the small airport, urging an immediate emergency landing clearance, Nick turned to Vanessa. "We have to assume they'll come after us once we're on the ground," he said. "They know the meltdown trick didn't kill us, and they won't want us revealing this technology." Vanessa glanced at the overhead panel, expression grim. "We'll have to rely on the local authorities and hope they don't get strong-armed by corporate or government influence." That's not a comforting thought. The plane descended with a nerve-wracking shudder as Drake aligned them for final approach. The civilian airstrip, more of a glorified runway with a handful of hangars, came into view through the cockpit glass. Nick made out a couple of small planes parked near a cluster of buildings. The presence of a control tower, albeit a modest one, offered some measure of hope. If they landed safely, they could possibly barricade themselves or get help before the pursuers made their move. During the descent, the G700's left engine sputtered, sending a ripple of panic through the cabin. The meltdown attempt had obviously taken its toll. Drake fought to maintain altitude, sweat beating at his temples. Nick braced himself against the console, scanning readouts. "We're losing thrust, but it's still enough for a controlled landing," Drake said through gritted teeth. Vanessa quietly flipped open her phone, possibly trying again to contact her Washington link. But no luck. She shook her head in frustration. At just a few hundred feet off the runway, Nick spotted people below airport staff or bystanders, wide-eyed at the sight of a luxury jet trailing thin black smoke. The plane slammed onto the runway harder than normal, bouncing twice before Drake wrestled it into a full stop. Brakes squealed, tires screeched, and the cabin rattled like it might tear apart. But then, mercifully, they were on solid ground. A chorus of alarms filled the cockpit as Drake powered down what remained of the engines. Fire trucks, or at least small airport emergency vehicles, raced toward them. Nick exhaled a shaky sigh, glancing again at the radar. The unidentified plane was still up there, circling at a higher altitude, likely waiting to see if they'd exit the craft. "We need to move fast," he told Vanessa. "They'll come for the amplifier or for us." Exiting the Gulfstream, they were met by panicked airport personnel, already dousing the engines with foam to prevent any flare-ups. Nick shouted that they had an urgent security threat, referencing sabotage on board. The staff exchanged confused looks, but they seemed ready to help. Vanessa quickly requested private hangar space to shield them from overhead watchers. Meanwhile, Drake sagged against the fuselage, exhausted but relieved they'd made it down alive. In that tense swirl of foam, shouting voices, and the acrid smell of overheated metal, Nick's heart pounded with a renewed sense of purpose. They had survived a meltdown attempt in an aerial stalker. Now, the next phase of this high-stakes ordeal would unfold on the ground. If the unknown pursuers decided to attack, or if corporate enforcers arrived, they'd have to defend themselves and the technology until they could hand it off to someone trustworthy. The question remained, did any trustworthy authority truly exist? Or were they about to fight a battle with no allies in sight? A swirl of white foam and acrid smoke enveloped the Gulfstream G700's undercarriage as airport fire safety crews worked frantically to prevent an engine flare-up. Nick West coughed against the chemical haze, signaling to Maxwell Drake and Vanessa Caldwell that they needed to move quickly. The small civilian airstrip, a mere cluster of low-slung hangars, a single control tower, and a tiny terminal felt entirely ill-prepared for the kind of danger descending upon them. Overhead, the unidentified aircraft circled silently, like a vulture waiting for the final demise of its prey. Local staff rushed over in reflective vests and wide-brimmed hats, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. One older mechanic, whom Nick recognized from a previous airport conference, tried to direct the foam hoses more accurately around the overheated engine intakes. Meanwhile, Vanessa pulled a small radio from her jacket, switching frequencies to see if they had better luck contacting law enforcement here. The signal was scratchy, hampered by some form of interference. Nick suspected the same group hacking the plane might be jamming local transmissions to keep them isolated. Maxwell Drake, still shaken but functioning, turned to Nick. "We need to hide that amplifier system, or at least keep it from prying eyes." He gestured at the G700's cargo door, which was now partially open. "If the people chasing us track it to this spot, they'll want to yank it out by force." Nick nodded. Despite having installed a kill switch, the hardware remained dangerously valuable. Leaving it in the open was like leaving a loaded weapon on a table for anyone to grab. The immediate challenge, however, was persuading the local airport manager to let them use a private hangar. Vanessa, adopting her most authoritative tone, approached him with identification and a sanitized explanation the aircraft had faced sabotage, carried classified corporate technology, and needed secure storage. She flashed an Apex Aero identification badge, which, in more metropolitan settings, might open doors. Here, the manager just seemed bewildered and a bit intimidated. After several tense minutes, he relented, gesturing to an older Quonset hut on the far side of the field. Nick, Vanessa, and Drake quickly organized the ground crew to tow the G700 to that secluded spot. The plane's left engine still emitted sporadic hisses of steam, but with the foam now coating it, the danger of immediate fire had subsided. A forklift rumbled up, hooking onto the nose gear to guide the plane across the cracked tarmac. Above them, the watchful silhouette of the hostile aircraft continued circling, clearly waiting for the right moment to strike, or perhaps relaying real-time intel to an unknown operator. Moving across the runway felt like traversing a battlefield in slow motion. Nick glanced behind him, heart hammering. Every pivot of the forklift, every roll of the jet's tires, seemed to last an eternity. Airport staff, clueless to the deeper stakes, chattered about the possible terrorist angle or some big-time corporate sabotage. Nick kept his eyes peeled for any sign of infiltration or approach from the perimeter fence. Sooner or later, those after the amplifier would arrive on the ground, and with no official backup, Nick, Vanessa, and Drake would have to defend themselves however they could. Once the Gulfstream was secured inside the Quonset hut, Nick stood by a dented metal door that could be locked from the inside. The structure wasn't exactly Fort Knox rusted beams, holes in the roofing, and a single overhead lamp that flickered ominously, but it was better than leaving the plane exposed. As he turned the old-fashioned lock, Nick's mind replayed the last 12 hours of sabotage attempt in midair, a meltdown barely averted, and an unknown spy rummaging around the cargo hold. All that felt like a mere prelude to what might come next. If they didn't find a way to expose this covert technology to a trusted authority soon, they'd remain targets with nowhere truly safe to land. Inside the Quonset hut, the temperature soared despite the early morning hour. Corrugated metal walls absorbed the Nevada sun's heat, turning the interior into a stifling oven. Nick West wiped sweat from his brow and began directing the airport's forklift operator on where to position the Gulfstream. With the nose pointed toward the large double doors, they could theoretically make a quick exit if needed. Vanessa Caldwell hovered nearby, scanning her phone for any signal. Maxwell Drake, pale from the tension, was retrieving emergency gear from the jet's storage compartments. A few local mechanics approached, offering cautious assistance. Nick quickly explained that they might be facing sabotage or a possible paramilitary threat, urging them to keep watch outside. For the most part, the locals stared in disbelief. Ardenfield might have had its share of trouble, but to them, this level of drama seemed ripped from a spy thriller. One old man in grease-stained overalls just muttered, "I've seen a lot of things all in my day, but this is new," before heading off to secure the main doors. As the forklift operator chugged out of the hut, Nick and Vanessa watched the dust swirl behind him, leaving them nearly alone. The overhead lamp cast stark shadows across the G700's fuselage, highlighting scorch marks and chipped paint from their harrowing flight. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Vanessa exhaled, eyes glassy with fatigue and worry. "We can't stay here indefinitely," she said. "Whatever faction inside Apex Aero orchestrated this will have local assets. They'll track me through corporate channels or find us via flight records. They might already be en route." Nick nodded. "I'm guessing we've only got hours at best. That plane overhead might even land soon or dispatch ground teams." He ran a hand across the plane's hull. "The kill switch we installed should prevent meltdown, but it won't stop them from removing the amplifier outright. We need a plan to ensure they don't get that hardware." It was then that Maxwell Drake emerged from the cabin, holding a heavy aluminum case. "I've found a drive with all the flight data, everything from the test flights and the remote overrides. This is major evidence," he said, voice trembling with the weight of its significance. "If we can get it to the right people, it proves what they've been doing." Vanessa pursed her lips. "But who are the right people? My contact in Washington could be compromised. The local sheriff's office. They're not equipped for this. Going public is an option, but we risk a bigger mess and possibly bigger hazards if everything spills out unchecked." Before Nick could respond, a harsh banging on the Quonset hut's exterior startled them. A muffled voice called out, "Sheriff's Department, open up." Nick and Vanessa exchanged alarmed glances. They had no idea if it truly was the sheriff, Bill Hinckley, or someone impersonating him. Guns drawn, they cautiously approached the side entrance. Nick forced his voice to remain steady. "Identify yourself, it's me." Hinckley came the testy reply. "Got a tip about suspicious activity and an emergency landing." "Let me in." Nick unlocked the door, his muscles coiled with tension. Sure enough, Sheriff Bill Hinckley stood there, sweat on his brow and a hand resting on his holstered sidearm. He took in the scene smoke-scarred jet, nervous faces, and shook his head. "Lord Almighty. West, I figured you were in deep, but I didn't expect all this." In a flurry of words, Nick explained the sabotage, the meltdown threat, and the shadowy plane overhead. Hinckley's expression shifted from shock to grim determination. "We got reports of that unidentified aircraft. My deputies are on standby, but we're shorthanded. If you're telling me you've got hard evidence of a major corporate or military black ops fiasco, then we need immediate backup from the feds. But who do we trust to call?" That was the riddle none of them had solved. The hush in the Quonset hut was deafening. This rural sheriff was out of his league, but at least he seemed honest. Nick, Vanessa, and Drake all eyed one another. The clock was ticking, and the unknown adversaries were sure to strike soon. Their only chance might be combining local law enforcement presence with a desperate push to contact an untainted federal official, if such a person existed. While Sheriff Hinckley conferred with his deputy on a crackling radio, Nick, Vanessa, and Maxwell Drake retreated deeper into the Quonset hut, seeking privacy to finalize their next moves. The small group's tension was palpable. Every now and then, one of them would cast an anxious glance at the overhead lamp, half expecting it to flicker out under the oppressive heat. Outside, engines rumbled as local law enforcement vehicles began arriving, forming a loose security perimeter around the airstrip. Nick pulled out the battered aluminum case Drake had recovered from the Gulfstream and snapped it open. Inside lay a portable solid-state drive and stacks of printed flight reports marked with Apex Aero's insignia. Vanessa rummaged through the papers, her brow furrowing as she recognized data logs showing dangerously high power outputs during clandestine test flights. More telling were internal memos referencing codenames Vanguard, Project Ares, and disturbingly, Omega Edge. Nick suspected that last one might be the meltdown scenario or a fallback plan for forced sabotage. This is enough evidence to implicate them in illegal testing, Vanessa said, scanning the pages. But only if we can get it into the right hands. The moment they realize we have it, they'll come for us harder than before. Maxwell Drake shuddered. I'm not built for firefights. I just fly planes. Maybe we give it to the sheriff. Let him pass it on. Nick shook his head. Hinckley's outgunned, and if we send it through normal channels, it might vanish into a black hole. They've been burying my father's research for decades. He recalled how Graham West's cautionary notes had mysteriously disappeared after his death, only to resurface in bits and pieces. We need a personal, direct line to someone with enough clout to override corporate secrecy, but not so high up they're compromised. Vanessa hesitated, then took a slow breath. I know a retired Air Force General, Walter Harrington. He's old school, left the service because he opposed private sector infiltration of key defense contracts. If we can reach him, he might have the connections to blow this wide open. Then let's do it, Nick said, grabbing a satellite phone from the plane's emergency kit. The conventional cell signals were jammed or unreliable, but maybe the sat phone could cut through. Vanessa took it, punching in a number from memory. They waited, hearts pounding, as static crackled. Finally, a gravelly voice answered. Vanessa introduced herself, giving a terse explanation. Nick and Drake, ears pressed close, heard Harrington's expletives of shock. Moments later, the general's tone calmed, and he promised to see what he could do from his end, but he needed time. Time, Nick repeated sarcastically once Vanessa hung up. Sure. While we wait, that plane overhead or some ground assault team is probably forming up. He looked around the Quonset hut. We have limited cover, a damaged aircraft, and a handful of local cops. This is going to get messy. Vanessa didn't disagree. She went to the G700's open cargo door and peered inside. The amplifier system loomed, menacing in its silent capacity for destruction. The kill switch might prevent meltdown, but it wouldn't stop bullets or a determined theft. Turning back to Nick, she said, we have to fortify our position. Keep them from extracting the amplifier until Harrington can intervene. In that moment, a fresh wave of sirens broke through the air. The muffled chatter of voices outside told them reinforcements, either friend or foe, had arrived. Sheriff Hinckley stuck his head in the door, calling out, "We've got black SUVs rolling up, tinted windows, no plates. This looked familiar to you." Nick exchanged grim looks with Vanessa and Drake. The standoff they dreaded had arrived. Now it was about survival and making sure the truth didn't die on this scorching tarmac. The newly arrived SUVs formed a small convoy, parking just outside the makeshift law enforcement perimeter. Uniformed deputies spread out, hands on holsters but visibly nervous. The vehicle's doors swung open to reveal men in dark suits, some wearing earpieces, others openly carrying firearms. One stepped forward, flashing a badge that looked vaguely federal, though Nick West suspected it was either fake or from a specialized agency not on mainstream rosters. Sheriff Hinckley stepped up to meet them, posture tense, local sun glinting off his belt buckle. Nick, Vanessa, and Maxwell Drake stood near the Quonset hut's entrance, half hidden behind crates labeled with aircraft maintenance labels. Vanessa swore under her breath. That's exactly the kind of muscle I warned about. They're probably from the same faction behind the sabotage. The lead suit, a tall man with slicked back hair and a taut expression, introduced himself loudly as Agent Moreland and demanded immediate access to the crashed aircraft. Citing national security, Hinckley, uncertain but protective of his jurisdiction, asked to see a warrant. Moreland's lips twisted into a condescending smile. He produced a piece of paper from his jacket, though from the distance, Nick couldn't tell if it was legitimate. This is a sealed federal order, Moreland declared de Neon, voice cold. We have reason to believe that this plane is carrying unauthorized technology. Hand it over, or we'll retrieve it by force." The tension crackled, and for a beat, no one moved. Then a second SUV door opened, and out stepped another figure, an unmistakable presence in a black tactical uniform, armed with a submachine gun. Sheriff Hinckley's jaw set. He radioed his deputies not to fire unless fired upon, but keep a line. Nick's pulse hammered. If Moreland and his men stormed the Quonset hut, the half-dozen local officers wouldn't stand a chance against a trained paramilitary group. Meanwhile, the overhead plane had vanished, either out of fuel or confident their ground team could handle the situation. Nick felt a vibration from his pocket. The satellite phone. He yanked it out, stepping behind one of the crates to answer. It was General Harrington, his voice hushed and urgent. "Caldwell told me the gist. Listen, you're dealing with a clandestine group. They're not officially sanctioned but have deep ties in certain agencies. Stand your ground if you can. I've called in a favor with an Air Force unit stationed not far from there, but you need to hold out. Once they arrive, you can place the technology under official military lockdown." Nick's chest tightened. How long until those reinforcements showed up? Every second increased the odds of bloodshed. He relayed Harrington's message to Vanessa, who looked both relieved and terrified. They had to buy time, so she strode out into the morning light, walking straight toward Moreland. Nick tensed, but he saw Vanessa's posture exude corporate confidence. "Agent Moreland," she said, voice ringing out. "I'm Vanessa Caldwell of Apex Aero. This plane belongs to my division, and we have the right to handle its contents internally." She brandished her own sheaf of documents. "Your claim of federal authority is unverified. Show me your chain of command." Moreland's eyes narrowed. The crowd of watchers, including local deputies, grew dead silent. Nick recognized that if Moreland gave the order, they could forcibly seize everything in seconds. But apparently, Moreland wanted to avoid open confrontation, perhaps to keep the operation under the radar. He instead barked, "You're obstructing a federal investigation. We'll give you 5 minutes to comply, or we'll take the plane." Vanessa shot a glance back at Nick, who gave a subtle nod. 5 minutes. Maybe that was enough to finalize their defenses. Nick ducked inside the hut, barking orders at Maxwell Drake to secure the cargo hold. If they had to make a stand, they'd do so, stalling until Harrington's backup arrived. He just prayed 5 minutes wouldn't stretch into an eternity of gunfire. Because if Moreland's men got inside, or if one bullet hit the wrong place, that meltdown kill switch might be the last line of defense, triggering a disastrous chain reaction that would scorch them all. Nick's voice echoed within the Quonset hut as he motioned 2 local mechanics to help roll a massive tool chest against the cargo door of the G700. Maxwell Drake dashed into the cockpit to retrieve flight data backups and stow them in a hidden compartment near the floor panels. Every move felt frantic, overshadowed by the countdown that Moreland had imposed. Outside, Vanessa Caldwell attempted to stall him, firing off legal-sounding terms like corporate property rights and export control regulations. Sheriff Hinckley hovered near the entrance, uncertain if he should physically bar Moreland's men from entering. If they had genuine federal credentials, he risked being charged with interfering in a government operation. Yet every fiber of his local lawman's intuition told him these men were not straightforward. Their aggression, their unmarked SUVs, and their borderline paramilitary stance reeked of black ops. Inside the cabin of the Gulfstream, Nick turned to Drake. "We have to neutralize the amplifier. If they drag it out intact, no kill switch in the world will stop them from analyzing and replicating it later." Drake hesitated, biting his lip. He recalled how intricately they'd installed that kill switch. If we physically break or remove key components, we might cause an unintentional meltdown, he warned. One spark, and he mimed an explosion with his hands. Nick cursed under his breath. Time was too short for a careful extraction. Yet letting the amplifier remain fully assembled was unacceptable. "We'll have to sever the main couplings. That should keep it from functioning, but not cause an overload." Drake nodded. Together, they pried open an access panel. A nest of wires glinted under the overhead lamp. Carefully, Nick pulled out a pair of insulated wire cutters. recalling the meltdown thresholds from his father's notes. With painstaking slowness, he snipped the primary feed lines, then methodically disconnected a small board that regulated voltage spikes. Each move had to be precise. The tension was enough to make his hand tremble, but he forced himself steady. Drake watched, swallowing hard as the last cable parted with a tiny spark. The system whirred, then fell silent. If they did it right, the amplifier was now inert, just a hunk of metal without the specialized circuit board that gave it purpose. A roar of male voices echoed outside. Moreland's 5-minute ultimatum had presumably expired. "Where is Caldwell?" Nick whispered. Drake answered that she was still out there with the sheriff. Nick closed the access panel, pocketing the severed board. "Come on, we need to help her face them, or they'll smash their way in." They hurried down the makeshift steps, only to see the Quonset hut's main doors burst open. Moreland's men, guns raised, spilled inside. One tackled Maxwell Drake to the ground. Nick froze, heart pounding, as two other operatives approached him, leveling firearms at his chest. Over their shoulders, he glimpsed Vanessa Caldwell outside in the sun, forcibly restrained by another agent. Sheriff Hinckley and his deputies stood in a standoff a dozen yards away, weapons drawn but outnumbered. "Hands where I can see them," snarled one of the men. Nick complied, raising his arms. He sensed Drake's panicked breathing behind him. They were effectively pinned. Moreland strode in, scanning the Gulfstream silhouette. "We'll be taking this plane under protective custody," he announced. "If you resist, you'll be charged with treason and conspiracy." Nick opened his mouth to protest, but a sharp blow to his ribs from a rifle butt cut him short. He winced, crumpling slightly. Moreland locked eyes with him in a predatory smirk. "Where's the amplifier?" "West, we know it's on board. Don't try to tell us it's broken." Nick clenched his jaw, refusing to answer. If the kill switch or the severed board kept them from reactivating it, maybe there was still hope. But with guns pointed at them, that hope felt awfully slender. In that moment, a faint rumble could be heard from overhead. Nick's eyes widened. He prayed it was the cavalry General Harrington had promised. Moreland's men seemed to notice too, glancing upward with uneasy expressions. The standoff was about to escalate, and the question remained whose side would the next arrivals be on. A heavy thumping echoed across the runway as a trio of helicopters appeared in the scorching Nevada sky. Moreland's men exchanged alarmed looks, uncertain if these inbound craft were friend or foe. Nick West, kneeling on the concrete floor with his arms still raised, felt a surge of cautious optimism. Could this be the Air Force unit General Harrington had mentioned? He silently willed them to be exactly that. Within moments, the lead helicopter circled above the Quonset hut, stirring up a whirl of dust that obscured the scene. Moreland barked orders at his subordinates to maintain positions, but a slight tremor in his voice betrayed his anxiety. Vanessa Caldwell, still held outside by two armed agents, squinted at the swirling grit. Nick tried to see through the haze as the choppers set down a short distance away. Over the roar of rotors, Nick heard authoritative voices. Military fatigues emerged from the dust cloud, at least a dozen soldiers wearing patches that Nick recognized from the 26th Special Operations Wing. Their weapons were drawn but pointed toward Moreland's group rather than the local deputies. A tall officer stepped forward, lifting goggles from his face. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez of the United States Air Force," he bellowed. "All unauthorized personnel, lower your weapons and step away from that aircraft." A hush fell. Even Moreland paused, clearly caught off guard. Nick watched Sheriff Hinckley lower his own weapon, relief plain on his face. Moreland, however, seemed uncertain. "We have federal authority here. This is a classified matter," he shouted back, though he didn't produce any new documentation. Ramirez signaled his men and a line of them advanced, rifles at the ready. Under direct orders from General Walter Harrington, the U.S. Air Force is assuming control of any hazardous technology on site. Ramirez declared, "We have a perimeter set up, and we will not tolerate resistance." A tense beat followed. Moreland's men looked to him for guidance. They were outnumbered by a specialized military unit, yet it was unclear if they would stand down or escalate. Nick felt his pulse pounding. If Moreland decided to open fire, it could become a bloodbath in seconds. Finally, Moreland snarled in frustration. You can't do this. We have a federal warrant. He lifted the paper again, but Ramirez didn't even glance at it. Instead, he gestured for his men to move in. Let's see that technology, the lieutenant colonel said, ignoring Moreland's claims. And if it's what we suspect, we're taking it into secure military custody. Civilian or rogue agent interference be damned. Vanessa, still pinned by the two agents, called out, Colonel Ramirez, we have the data and can confirm. The plane's amplifier is compromised. This group is not acting in official capacity. Ramirez turned his steely gaze upon her captors. Release her, or my men will do it for you. Reluctantly, the suits relinquished their grip on Vanessa. She stumbled forward, massaging her wrists. Nick stood as well, a soldier pulling him to his feet, then patting him down for weapons. In the swirling dust of rotor wash, with Moreland's men still glowering, it became clear that the standoff had tilted. The Air Force was here in force. Moreland's expression flickered between rage and calculation. He jerked his head at one of his men, who quickly radioed something. A new wave of tension rippled through the Quonset hut. If Moreland was calling for reinforcements, the scenario could yet spiral out of control. Nick inched closer to Vanessa, who clutched the aluminum case with the flight data. Her voice was steady but hushed. This is our chance. Let's get that data to Ramirez while we can. Nick nodded, relief and apprehension mixing in equal measure. The next few minutes would determine if they had finally found a legitimate authority to handle this technology, or if Moreland's hidden allies would transform the airstrip into a war zone. So with hearts hammering, they braced themselves for the potential final confrontation. The scorching desert wind searing their faces and the future of Vanguard technology hanging in the balance. As Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez and his special operations team secured the perimeter around the Quonset hut, Sheriff Hinckley stepped aside, grudgingly acknowledging that federal-level military involvement trumped his local jurisdiction. For his part, Nick West felt an immense weight lifting from his shoulders, at least for the moment. Moreland's men, still bristling with aggression, had been forced to holster their weapons, though Nick could practically see the fury simmering behind Moreland's eyes. Vanessa Caldwell approached Ramirez, carefully opening the aluminum case to show him the flight data logs and partial schematics. Nick hovered just behind her, occasionally chiming in. They explained how the G700 had nearly experienced a meltdown, how unknown hackers attempted to override the system mid-flight, and how the amplifier's technology was originally derived from the late Graham West's research in Project Ares. Ramirez studied the documents, his frown deepening. Nick detected a mixture of alarm and resolve in the officer's gaze. That lines up with some of the chatter we've intercepted, Ramirez said, flipping through pages of sensor readouts. There's been talk of a rogue element inside certain agencies trying to push advanced energy tech to weaponizable levels. General Harrington believed your plane might be the missing piece. He lifted his gaze to Vanessa, adding, your father's work, Miss Caldwell, or your company's old acquisitions, are not fully known to us, but we do know enough to see the danger. Vanessa hesitated, then revealed more about Apex Aero's internal schism. The reason she defied her superiors was to keep the project from being exploited by more extremist factions. For Nick, it was almost surreal to see the conversation happening on an open-air runway, with heavily armed soldiers standing watch against the men in black suits. Yet he also felt a raw sense of validation. His father's warnings about meltdown scenarios were finally getting the serious attention they deserved. Meanwhile, Moreland, standing off to one side, made a tense phone call. Within earshot, Nick heard clipped phrases like, they brought the Air Force and we need immediate extraction. The notion of an impending standoff or rescue attempt for Moreland's group hung thick in the air. Ramirez, evidently picking up the vibe, signaled two of his soldiers to keep a close eye on Moreland's convoy. Nick, feeling a surge of protective instinct, quietly asked Vanessa, is the amplifier truly diffused? She nodded. We cut the main lines. Without the regulation board, it's useless, even if they try to remove it physically. It won't function. Nick exhaled in relief, but there was still the chance the data itself could be stolen or destroyed, as if reading his thoughts. Ramirez said, "We'll transport the plane to a secure hangar at Nellis Air Force Base. My men will personally oversee the amplifier. Miss Caldwell, we'll also take your flight data as evidence. You three will accompany us as key witnesses." Vanessa agreed. Nick felt a wave of gratitude, although a part of him worried about leaving local folks at the mercy of any last-minute retaliation. Glancing around, he spotted Sheriff Hinckley. The sheriff offered a tight smile. "Go on," he said. "We'll lock down the area. If any more black SUVs roll in, they'll find a welcome party. Just do me a favor. Tell your Air Force friends to keep me in the loop if they find out who's behind all this." Nick nodded, appreciating the man's calm under fire. Thus, the plan crystallized: a military convoy would haul the G700 out, or possibly patch it up enough for a short flight under escort. Moreland's group, forced into compliance, might attempt sabotage or infiltration along the way. But with Ramirez's squad on high alert, that route seemed less likely. For the first time in days, Nick allowed himself a flicker of hope that the truth behind his father's death, Apex Aero's buried secrets, and the meltdown threat would see proper justice. They just had to make it out of the desert in one piece. In the late afternoon heat, the Air Force orchestrated a methodical operation to prep the Gulfstream G700 for transport. Mechanics in standard-issue coveralls inspected the crippled engines, while Nick West and Maxwell Drake pointed out the compromised wiring. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez arranged for a specialized lowboy trailer to haul the jet, given that it couldn't safely fly again without significant repairs. By mid-evening, with the desert sun dipping low, the plan was set. They'd form a convoy heading toward Nellis Air Force Base under the watchful eye of Ramirez's armed vehicles. Moreland and his men still lingered, some pacing and making phone calls. Vanessa Caldwell stood with arm crossed, watching them warily. Every so often, she'd meet Nick's gaze, and they shared a silent question: what might Moreland be plotting next? The black-suited agent glared at Ramirez's soldiers, apparently aware he no longer had the upper hand. As darkness settled, the convoy lined up. At the front, two Humvees bristling with mounted guns. In the middle, the flatbed semi-trailer bearing the G700 flanked by more military trucks. Nick, Vanessa, and Maxwell Drake rode in an armored SUV near the front with Ramirez. Sheriff Hinckley would remain behind with his deputies to secure the airstrip. Nick, leaning forward in the seat, could still scarcely believe the day's events, from sabotage attempts to full-scale paramilitary standoff, all culminating in a bizarre cross-country trek with the U.S. Air Force. Pulling out of the airstrip, the convoy's headlights cut through the desert gloom. Moreland's SUVs followed at a distance, presumably not wanting to engage the heavily armed escort. Nick quietly asked Ramirez, "What if they try something on the road and ambush?" The colonel grimly replied that he had backup stationed along the road. Any hostile action from Moreland's group would be met with force. The caravan rumbled onto a highway, heading east under a canopy of stars. Occasionally, Nick glimpsed the reflection of black SUVs in the side mirrors, trailing behind at least half a mile. Ramirez kept a soldier manning a turret on the rear vehicle. The tension was thick, especially whenever the road veered around rocky outcroppings or overpasses where an ambush could be concealed. Inside the SUV, Vanessa sank against the seat, exhaustion evident. She confided in Nick that her entire career at Apex Aero had been overshadowed by these hidden programs. She tried to nudge the company toward ethical research, but powerful figures always wanted results fast, no matter the risk. "I should have walked away sooner," she muttered, voice heavy. Nick squeezed her hand. "You walked away when it mattered most. That's what counts," he said quietly. Recalling his father's eventual break with the Air Force, suddenly the radio crackled. A voice from the lead Humvee announced that the route ahead showed suspicious activity, multiple vehicles parked along the shoulder. No lights. Ramirez signaled the convoy to slow. "This could be it," he muttered. Vanessa and Nick exchanged tense looks. If Moreland had orchestrated a second wave, they might be forced into a firefight. Maxwell Drake paled, gripping the seat until his knuckles whitened. Up ahead, the glint of headlights flickered, and silhouettes darted behind vehicles. The wind carried a faint whistle, possibly from the open desert or from hushed voices. Ramirez barked instructions for his men to dismount carefully. Nick's heart hammered. Was this an actual blockade set by the same rogue faction? The next moments would decide if they advanced or ended up in a full-blown shootout. With the G700 in tow, a meltdown was no longer a threat, but bullets were just as lethal. Nick held his breath as the convoy ground to a halt, tension coiling like a spring in the night air. A cluster of lights erupted ahead as flashlights and headlamps clicked on, revealing a ragtag group near the road's edge. Nick West peered through the armored SUV's windshield. They looked more like local ranchers and travelers than a hit squad, no matching uniforms. No visible heavy weapons. Ramirez's lead Humvee inched closer, soldiers scanning for threats. To Nick's surprise, a grizzled man in a cowboy hat stepped forward, waving a flashlight. Ramirez exited the vehicle, hand near his holstered sidearm, and demanded to know if they were in distress. The cowboy explained that one of their trucks had a busted axle, stranding them. They'd tried to flag down help, but were wary of big convoys blasting through the night. The soldier in the turret remained on high alert, but the tension visibly deflated. This wasn't an ambush, just an unfortunate roadside breakdown. Nick exhaled, leaning back into the seat. Maxwell Drake muttered something about his nerves being shot. Vanessa Caldwell closed her eyes for a brief moment, relief washing over her features. Ramirez briefly spoke with the cowboy and then offered a tow or a ride to the nearest town once the convoy's mission was complete. The man tipped his hat in gratitude. As the caravan resumed, Nick caught sight of the black SUVs still following, maintaining their distance. Part of him worried they might attempt something more covert, but for now it seemed they were just tracking, perhaps hoping to strike once the Air Force presence thinned out. The miles churned by in grim procession. At intervals, the radio squawked with status updates from the rear guard. Nick stared at the starlit desert through the SUV window, recalling how his father once said the southwestern skies were as vast as the secrets hidden beneath them. He could almost feel Graham West's presence in the hum of the tires, urging him to see this through, to ensure no one else died because of unchecked ambition. Around midnight, the convoy pulled into a makeshift checkpoint, an old supply depot that the military had reactivated for the night's operations. Ramirez directed the vehicles into a fenced area under floodlights. Soldiers stood guard towers with night vision gear. Inside the perimeter, the G700 was carefully maneuvered off the lowboy trailer and onto a concrete pad. Nick hopped out, stiff from the ride. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez approached them, expression serious but respectful. "We'll rest here a few hours before continuing to Nellis. The men need to refuel, and the plane hauling rig is running hot." He gestured to a large Quonset-style garage where they could store the Gulfstream. Nick was all too familiar with that style of structure by now. Vanessa nodded, stepping aside to phone her contact. General Harrington with an update. Meanwhile, Nick found Drake pacing anxiously, checking the sky. "I'm half expecting a stealth chopper to drop a squad of mercenaries on us," Drake muttered. Nick didn't entirely dismiss the idea. Moreland's group or others like them were proven relentless. Yet for the moment, the checkpoint felt secure. The floodlights turned the desert night into a harshly lit tableau. Soldiers methodically scanned the horizon, and the black SUVs appeared to have vanished, or at least receded beyond visible range. Sheriff Hinckley's domain was far behind them, and the safe confines of Nellis still lay hours ahead. Nick decided to use the lull to gather his thoughts. He retreated to a corner of the yard where a portable bench had been set up. Sitting down, he gazed at the battered G700. One of the engines was thoroughly scorched, the fuselage pockmarked. It looked a far cry from the sleek monstrosity that had landed at Arden Field. Yet this wounded plane carried the central artifact of a hidden arms race. If not for the kill switch in the severed amplifier lines, it might have become an unstoppable threat. Now, at least, it was silent. Pulling out the severed regulation board from his pocket, Nick studied the intricately etched circuits. It felt surreal to hold in his hands the device that could have triggered meltdown in midair. He resolved that once they delivered it to Nellis, He'd do everything possible to ensure no one reassembled it for nefarious purposes. Graham West's caution had cost him his life, and Nick refused to let that sacrifice be in vain. The checkpoint's artificial daylight cast harsh shadows across the desert floor. Most of Ramirez's soldiers took rotation breaks, slumping on crates or leaning against vehicles while a smaller group kept watch. The night air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of mesquite. Nick West lingered near the Gulf Stream, unable to fully relax. He spotted Vanessa Caldwell concluding a tense phone call with someone and decided to approach her. She looked up, her eyes reflecting the cold glare of overhead lights. "That was Harrington," she said, voice subdued. "He's still coordinating with the brass at Nellis. There's some pushback internal politics about whether to accept the plane and the amplifier. But Harrington's pulling every string he can." She paused, rubbing her temples. Apparently, certain officials question the legality of seizing corporate property, even though the meltdown threat is real. Nick scoffed. Unbelievable. After everything, they still bicker about ownership. People nearly died. This device could wreck entire cities if weaponized, but he knew from experience that bureaucracy often lagged behind moral imperatives. Vanessa set a hand on his shoulder. "Your father faced the same. He tried to blow the whistle, but the system moves slowly, and sometimes it doesn't move at all." They turned as Maxwell Drake joined them, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from a makeshift mess station. "Figured you could use this," he said quietly. The three stood there, sipping in silence, an odd camaraderie formed by their shared ordeal. In that moment, Nick recognized how far they'd come from strangers thrown together by a mysterious emergency landing to co-conspirators in dismantling a lethal technology. A commotion at the gate drew their attention. Moreland's black SUVs had returned, stopping just beyond the checkpoint fence. Ramirez and several armed soldiers approached them with flashlights. Nick's stomach tightened. The confrontation was far from over. He, Vanessa, and Drake moved closer to witness what might unfold. Near the fence, Agent Moreland stepped out, hands raised in a show of non-aggression. Still, Nick noted the tension in the soldiers around him. Moreland demanded a private audience with Ramirez. The lieutenant colonel initially refused, insisting that any discussion happen publicly. Moreland then produced another set of documents, claiming fresh federal orders from a higher authority. Ramirez scanned the papers under a flashlight. The lines on his face hardened. "This is contradictory. We have a direct order from General Harrington," he said, voice clipped. Moreland smirked. "These come from the Defense Intelligence Directorate. Colonel, it supersedes local base commands." Nick's heart pounded. Could Moreland have conjured up legitimate orders that overrode the Air Force presence? The potential for a bureaucratic labyrinth seemed endless. Vanessa clenched her fists. "He's playing the same power game. Our entire system is riddled with departmental overlaps." A standoff blossomed at the gate as Moreland's men advanced, but still behind the chain-link fence. Ramirez refused them entry, citing the ongoing operation. The tension was palpable, each side brandishing new pieces of paper, each side claiming the other lacked jurisdiction. Nick whispered to Drake, "If Moreland's docs check out, this might end with them rolling in here, guns blazing." Drake's eyes flickered with panic. "We're back where we started." Vanessa threw them both a determined look. "No, we're not helpless. We have Harrington and the truth. If it comes to a direct conflict, the chain of command might tear itself apart, but we can still get the data out to public channels if needed." Nick recalled how his father never had the chance to go public, having been silenced too soon. Now, these new digital avenues might let them circumvent legal entanglements. He pictured uploading the meltdown data online, or sending it to major media outlets. The fallout would be catastrophic for Apex Aero, and possibly for the entire defense sector. Yet if all else failed, it might be the only way to keep the amplifier from morphing into a doomsday device. As the stalemate continued, Nick readied himself for any scenario. The night advanced, but nobody was sleeping. Moreland's men waited beyond the fence. Ramirez's soldiers patrolled inside, and Nick, Vanessa, and Drake stood in the crosshairs between unstoppable corporate momentum an immovable military procedure. Something had to give, and soon. Shortly after midnight, an unexpected development rattled both sides. General Walter Harrington himself arrived by helicopter, flanked by two assistants in subdued Air Force uniforms. The entire checkpoint buzzed with a mixture of reverence and apprehension as the chopper landed in a clearing, rotor wash stirring clouds of grit. When the dust settled, Harrington, tall and stoic despite his advanced age, stepped onto the desert floor with purposeful strides. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez snapped a salute, and Harrington returned it sharply before surveying the scene. Nick West, Vanessa Caldwell, and Maxwell Drake observed from a short distance, anxiously awaiting what the general would do. Moreland, for his part, stood near the gate, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Harrington spoke with Ramirez first, exchanging hushed words about the standoff. Then he strode toward the chain-link fence, where Moreland's men stood. "Agent Moreland," he began in a low, commanding tone. "I've reviewed your documents. They conflict with the directives granted to me by the Joint Chiefs. Unless you provide unequivocal proof that you outrank that chain, I'm placing you and your operation on standby pending official review." Moreland tried to interject, brandishing the supposed directive from the Defense Intelligence Directorate, but Harrington cut him off. "I know the DIP well. I've served under half its directors. They don't have unilateral authority to commandeer an Air Force operation on domestic soil without explicit orders from the Secretary of Defense or the President. Show me that, or step aside." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Moreland's face. He glanced at his men, who were shifting uncomfortably. Nick sensed that Moreland had banked on intimidation and ambiguous legalese to reclaim the amplifier. Now confronted with Harrington's knowledge and rank, his bluff was losing ground. Inside the checkpoint, Vanessa leaned toward Nick, murmuring, "This might turn the tide. Harrington has the authority we needed." Nick nodded, relief blossoming in his chest. He watched as the general turned and waved them over. They obliged, stepping out from behind the Gulf Stream. "Ms. Caldwell, Mr. West, Mr. Drake." Harrington greeted them formally. "Ramirez has kept me informed, but I want a direct statement from you regarding the nature of this technology and the meltdown risk. We have to finalize our strategy before dawn." His tone brooked no hesitation, every bit the seasoned commander. Vanessa handed Harrington the aluminum case with flight data. "Sir, this is the complete record. Inside, you'll also find documents from Nick's father, Graham West, proving the meltdown scenario is real." Harrington opened the case, flipping through pages, occasionally lifting an eyebrow at the details. Turning back to Moreland, still lurking outside the fence, Harrington raised his voice. "Agent Moreland, I have in my possession evidence that this device can cause catastrophic chain reactions. If your office wants to challenge that, you do so under the scrutiny of a full legal inquiry. For now, the Air Force is taking custody to prevent a potential national disaster. Stand down or face formal obstruction charges." Nick half expected Moreland to order an assault. Instead, the man's face twisted with a barely concealed rage. He spat on the ground, then signaled his men to return to their SUVs. "This isn't over, General," Moreland growled. "You're meddling in affairs you don't understand. We'll have a hearing about your overreach." The black-suited entourage filed back into their vehicles, engines revving. Sheriff Hinckley's deputies and the Air Force soldiers stood ready, but Moreland's group made no moves to breach the perimeter. Moments later, the SUVs peeled away into the desert night, headlights disappearing around a bend. A hush fell, and Harrington exhaled, turning to his men. "We'll maintain readiness in case they return. Ramirez, secure the plane for immediate transport to Nellis." Nick and Vanessa exchanged a stunned glance. Had they just witnessed the retreat of the very faction that had hounded them for days? Maxwell Drake all but collapsed against the Gulfstream's scorched fuselage in relief. The battle wasn't necessarily won, but a major threat had just backed down. Harrington's presence had tipped the scale. In the glare of the checkpoint floodlights, Nick walked up to the general, heart pounding with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "My father never had someone like you to protect him. We might not have survived without your help." Harrington clasped Nick's shoulder, wearing a grave expression. Son, this is just the beginning. Once we get that device to a secure lab, we'll see what else is lurking in the shadows. The relentless desert wind gusted, carrying away the last trace of dust from the departing SUVs. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Nick allowed himself to exhale, convinced that if there was ever a chance to do right by his father's memory and shield the world from reckless ambition, they had just seized it. Come dawn, the checkpoint sprang into organized action. Large trucks and additional Air Force units arrived to fully enclose the Gulfstream G700, essentially building a temporary transport cradle around the plane's fuselage to keep it stable for the road trip to Nellis. Nick West aided the team, explaining which panels were most vulnerable due to the earlier sabotage. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez methodically assigned roles, ensuring every soldier and mechanic knew their tasks. Vanessa Caldwell disappeared into a makeshift communications tent to finalize the legal framework. She planned to sign over the amplifier and all relevant data to the Air Force for forensic evaluation, a bold move that would enrage certain factions at Apex Aero. Maxwell Drake lingered by the plane's cargo hold, occasionally wincing at the bruises from his earlier scuffle. Nick took a moment to walk the perimeter. Out beyond the fence, local desert shrubs swayed in a gentle breeze, as if nature itself were oblivious to the potential meltdown and corporate scheming that had nearly unfolded. Moreland's vehicles were gone, but Nick suspected they were only regrouping, waiting for an opening. He spotted General Harrington standing atop a small dirt embankment, scanning the horizon through binoculars. Approaching quietly, Nick joined him, following the older man's gaze. Expecting them back, he asked. Harrington lowered the binoculars, nodding. Men like Moreland don't walk away forever. But we have a tight legal stance now. If they try to seize the plane again, they'll be in direct conflict with an official U.S. military order. Nick thought about his father, how Graham West had fought a losing battle against bureaucracy and hush-hush programs. Could you tell me how you knew my dad? Nick asked tentatively. Harrington sighed, half smiling. Back in the day, I was a younger officer overseeing advanced propulsion tests. Your father was the civvy genius we brought in to solve intractable problems. But he also had moral lines he wouldn't cross, refused to let us scale up certain experiments without thorough safety trials. Some higher-ups disliked that. I respected him. A pang of sadness hit Nick. He died for it, didn't he? Harrington stared at the horizon, voice quiet. I can't prove it definitively, but too many coincidences surrounded his crash. I tried to push for an investigation. I was stonewalled, swallowing hard. Nick realized how close he'd come to following the same tragic path. If Vanessa hadn't forced that emergency landing at Arden Field, if he hadn't discovered the meltdown risk, he might have ended up another footnote in a cover-up. Down below, the forklift engines roared to life, lifting the G700's nose onto a massive flatbed. Ramirez shouted instructions, and soldiers guided steel cables into place. Harrington clapped Nick on the shoulder. Your father would be proud you stuck to your principles, even when it put you in the line of fire. Nick simply nodded, a knot in his throat. They descended the embankment and joined the final prep. Once strapped down, the plane would be escorted along a secured route to Nellis. Ramirez had arranged aerial recon to ensure no ambush. Nick also noted that Harrington's presence alone was a powerful deterrent. Anyone attacking a convoy personally overseen by a high-ranking general risked open treason. Soon, Vanessa returned from the communications tent, her shoulders tense but her expression resolute. She handed Nick a folder containing copies of her agreement with the Air Force. It's done, she said. Apex Aero will face a storm of legal suits, but they can't claim we stole the plane. This is official national security territory now. Nick flipped through the pages, reading terms that spelled out indefinite government custody for all Vanguard or Ares components. He exhaled slowly. The meltdown device would be out of corporate hands, at least for now. Maxwell Drake ambled over, asking if this meant they could finally rest. A wry chuckle passed among them. Even if the immediate crisis was easing, the aftermath investigations, potential corporate vendettas, and public fallout loomed. Yet as they watched the G700's battered frame hoisted into transport position, Nick felt a semblance of closure. The same plane that nearly ended in catastrophic meltdown, that had carried the seeds of his father's controversial research, was about to be sealed away, hopefully for safer scrutiny, for the first time in years. Nick sensed he might be able to live without the lingering ghost of Graham West's unresolved legacy. In his heart, he silently thanked his father for guiding him toward caution and moral clarity in a domain so often ruled by ambition and greed. The convoy rolled out mid-morning under a blazing sun, the G700 perched on a mammoth flatbed like a caged beast. General Harrington led the procession, riding in a command Humvee with Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez, while Nick West, Vanessa Caldwell, and Maxwell Drake followed in a separate armored vehicle. Soldiers in full tactical gear guarded every flank, with a helicopter overhead scouting for any sign of Moreland's faction or other threats. Highway asphalt stretched before them in a heat haze. Nick gazed from the reinforced window, half expecting black SUVs to appear at any moment. Instead, the roads were eerily empty, as if civilians had been rerouted or had sensed trouble and stayed away. Occasionally, the radio crackled with updates from the Air Force pilot overhead, confirming clear skies. Inside the armored vehicle, Maxwell Drake tried to make light conversation, but tension muted his attempts. Vanessa Caldwell spent much of the ride on her phone, leaving urgent voice messages for Apex Aero's board of directors, trying to explain that she'd had no choice but to comply with the Air Force. Nick offered silent support, squeezing her hand whenever her frustration peaked. He knew she was likely burning bridges with some powerful corporate allies, but she appeared resolute in seeing this through. Hours passed in a steady drone of engine noise. Eventually, a break came when Harrington's voice sounded through the intercom, announcing a scheduled rest stop near a secure National Guard depot. Everyone needed a chance to stretch their legs, refuel vehicles, and check the G700's fastenings. On arrival, they found a walled compound with watchtowers, reminiscent of older desert installations. The gates swung open, and the convoy rumbled in. Nick hopped out, scanning the perimeter. Guards patrolled the walls, but the place felt calmer than the checkpoint they'd occupied the night before. The presence of Harrington lent an air of official weight to everything. "We'll take 30 minutes, Ramirez announced, stepping down from the lead Humvee. "Keep eyes peeled. No sign of Moreland yet, but we're not letting our guard down." Nick found himself standing beside the battered G700 dwarfed by the trailer's metal scaffolding. He thought of how this plane had started as a symbol of corporate luxury, sleek, white, pampered. Now it was charred and battered, a scarred war trophy more than a private jet. Maxwell Drake approached, hands in his pockets. "Never thought I'd see my bird like this," he murmured. "I guess it's better than seeing it in a smoking crater." Nick nodded, recalling the meltdown scare, mid-flight. A random memory of the masked intruder at Arden Field flashed through his mind. Had that been an agent of Moreland's, or was it a third party representing some other shadowy interest? The more he learned, the clearer it became that multiple groups vied for advanced tech. Even with Harrington's help, fully containing it might be an endless game of cat and mouse. Vanessa Caldwell joined them. Phone in hand, she looked exhausted but purposeful. "I managed to reach a couple of the more ethical board members. They're furious but grudgingly supportive. They'd rather cooperate with the Air Force than risk a meltdown scandal that kills thousands." She paused, managing a wry smile. Small victories. Across the compound, Harrington and Ramirez discussed final logistical details. Nick overheard talk of a secure hangar at Nellis, isolated from typical flight lines, where the G700 could be analyzed by a joint investigative team. Nick's chest tightened at the thought that this entire saga might finally be concluding in a safe environment. Yet he couldn't shake a lingering sense of foreboding. The secrets behind Vanguard or Project Ares wouldn't vanish overnight. Even if one faction was thwarted, corporate or governmental ambition wouldn't just vanish. Perhaps the best they could do was keep the technology under vigilant oversight, ensuring each attempt at dangerous experimentation would face scrutiny. Nick exhaled, stepping away from the trailer to find a bit of shade under a corrugated awning. One of Harrington's aides passed by, saluting politely. It struck Nick that he was, in a bizarre way, stepping into the role his father once played an independent conscience in the swirling vortex of militarized science. Whether or not the world would heed that conscience remained to be seen. By late afternoon, the convoy resumed its trek, eventually descending into the sprawling desert basin that housed Nellis Air Force Base. As they approached the main gates, Nick West marveled at the well-ordered lines of fighter jets and hangars shimmering in the distance. This was a far cry from the dusty corners of Arden Field, or the ad hoc checkpoints they'd manned earlier. Under an expansive American flag rippling in the hot breeze, armed sentries waved them through, their expressions set in disciplined neutrality. General Harrington led the vehicles onto a secure tarmac, away from the usual flight lines. Here, chain-link fences and concrete barriers surrounded a cluster of colossal hangars, each tall enough to swallow multiple cargo planes. Soldiers directed the G700's flatbed into position beside a building marked Hangar 18C, restricted access. Nick, Vanessa, and Maxwell Drake disembarked from their armored SUV, limbs stiff from travel, hearts pounding with the realization of what came next. Air Force technicians surrounded the trailer, preparing cranes and lifts to move the battered plane inside. Harrington approached the group, accompanied by a gray-haired civilian in a sharp suit. "This is Dr. Helena Pierce," he introduced. "She'll head the technical assessment of the plane. Miss Caldwell, she'll need your expertise on the corporate modifications." Vanessa shook hands with Dr. Pierce, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "I'll provide everything we have on the amplifier's design and its meltdown threshold." Dr. Pierce nodded briskly. "We'll also look for sabotage devices. If this fiasco taught us anything, it's that multiple hands have tampered with it." Nick hovered nearby, feeling an odd sense of detachment. Just 2 days ago, he was a simple mechanic at a rural airfield. Now he stood in the epicenter of a major investigation that spanned from corporate boardrooms to covert military factions. Maxwell Drake seemed equally at odds, rubbing his eyes as if expecting to wake up from a fever dream. Once inside Hangar 18C, the plane was carefully unloaded onto hydraulic jacks. The interior was massive, fluorescent lights revealing a polished concrete floor. Dr. Pierce wasted no time setting up a cordon around the G700 stationing armed guards. She demanded all data logs, which Harrington's aides promptly delivered in sealed cases. For Nick, the stark efficiency was almost comforting. At least these people seemed to know what they were doing. General Harrington guided Nick to a smaller side office, glass-walled so they could watch the unfolding inspection. "You've done your part," Harrington said, patting Nick on the shoulder. "We'll handle the rest. That amplifier stays under lock and key until the oversight committee arrives. If you want, you're free to return to civilian life once we finish debriefing." A swirl of emotions hit Nick. The idea of going home to Arden Field, back to the quiet routine of crop dusters and local pilots, felt both appealing and surreal. Could he just walk away, knowing how dangerously close the world came to a meltdown? He glanced at Vanessa, who was conferring with Dr. Pierce near the plane's open cargo doors. Something in her posture suggested she, too, was considering her next steps. Later, Maxwell Drake approached them, clutching a coffee cup. "They want to question me thoroughly about flight logs," he said anxiously. "I'll probably be here a while, but I'd rather be grounded than on the run." Nick nodded, offering a sympathetic smile. In truth, the sense of looming danger was gone, replaced by the hum of purposeful activity. Soldiers and scientists busied themselves with scanning the plane's every panel. Stepping outside, Nick squinted in the desert glare. Hangar 18C stood like a fortress amid a labyrinth of concrete runways. The horizon shimmered with heat. He tried to imagine normal life after this, a return to the modest hangar back home. Maybe a quiet dinner at the local diner. Could he truly slip back into anonymity after glimpsing the scale of clandestine machinations? Glancing down at his father's old toolbox, still battered from recent events, Nick felt a pang of nostalgia. Graham West had died trying to keep the world safe from misguided ambition. Now, Nick had played his part in preventing a global disaster. Maybe that was the closure he needed. With the meltdown threat contained, perhaps he could finally lay his father's ghost to rest. The official debrief stretched well into the night, held in a secure conference room adjacent to Hangar 18C. Nick West, Vanessa Caldwell, Maxwell Drake, and a panel of uniformed Air Force officers poured over every detail. From the moment the Gulfstream made its emergency landing at Arden Field to the final standoff with Moreland's rogue agents, Harrington oversaw the session, occasionally stepping out to handle phone calls. Technicians chimed in over video link, confirming that the amplifier's meltdown potential was real and that Nick's kill switch modifications had likely saved the plane. Around midnight, the meeting finally concluded. One by one, the officers departed, some shaking Nick's hand with genuine gratitude. Harrington was last to leave, pausing to tell them that full investigations would commence, shining a light on Apex Aero's hidden divisions and any government collaborators. "You all may be called as witnesses," he cautioned, then offered a tired smile. "But for now, you deserve rest." Nick, Vanessa, and Drake found themselves alone in the hushed corridor. A single overhead light flickered, highlighting their exhausted expressions. Maxwell Drake yawned, announcing he'd been given temporary quarters on the base. He bade them good night, leaving Nick and Vanessa quietly facing each other. "I guess we made it," Nick said, voice tinged with disbelief. His mind replayed the swirling events: the masked intruder, the mid-air hack, the threat of meltdown, Moreland's intimidation, and finally Harrington's arrival. Now it was over, at least for the moment. Vanessa exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "It's surreal," she admitted. "Apex Aero's board will be in disarray. We might face lawsuits, or even attempts to pin blame on us, but at least we contained the meltdown threat." She hesitated, searching his eyes. "What about you heading back to Arden Field?" Nick considered it. The idea of stepping into his ramshackle home, waking up at dawn to fix a battered Cessna, was alluring in its simplicity. Yet he also sensed a call to remain part of the bigger conversation. "Honestly, I'm not sure," he confessed. "I was always haunted by how my father's story ended. Now that we've avoided a similar catastrophe, maybe it's time I finally let that burden go." They slowly walked outside, stepping onto the quiet tarmac. Cool desert air brushed against them, the stars overhead brilliant and vast. Vans and jeeps were parked in orderly rows, each representing a piece of the logistical puzzle that had kept the meltdown device from escaping into the wrong hands. In the distance, Hangar 18C loomed, a silent guardian over the G700. Vanessa turned to Nick, a gentle sincerity in her gaze. "Whatever you decide." "Nick, you have a place in my new division, assuming I still have a seat at Apex Aero," she said with a faint smile. "We'll need people with integrity to ensure the next wave of research never crosses the line." Nick reached out, and their hands intertwined. He thought of the intangible bond formed by crisis. "Let's see how the dust settles," he replied softly. "If you're rebuilding the company for the better, maybe that's worth doing. I've got a father's legacy to honor and a lifetime of mechanical expertise to offer." For a few minutes, they simply gazed at the starlight. No words needed. The clamor and danger of the past days had receded, replaced by the promise of something new: cooperation, transparency, maybe even redemption for all that had gone wrong. A faint hum of engines indicated some overnight flight operations, but neither Nick nor Vanessa paid it much attention. They parted ways under the silent sky, each heading to assigned quarters within the base. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more statements, and likely more revelations about the shady networks behind Project Ares. Yet for this moment, Nick felt a calm acceptance in the hush of the desert night. They had stopped a meltdown, bridged differences between corporate ambition and ethical duty, and ensured that Graham West's cautionary wisdom lived on. Whatever came next, they would face it armed with truth, unity, and the hard-won knowledge that real progress demands responsibility. In the end, it wasn't the chaos of twisted metal, the echo of gunfire, or even the weight of betrayal that stayed with them. It was the quiet moments after. when the dust settled, and they were left alone with the truth they'd uncovered. Truths bought at a price higher than they'd ever imagined, paid not in dollars, but in trust, blood, and innocence forever lost. Sometimes survival comes at the cost of a piece of ourselves. For some, it meant finally seeing beyond the horizon they had always known. For others, it meant letting go of what they could no longer hold. Each had journeyed through fire and shadows, discovering that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to walk forward, despite knowing exactly how much it might hurt. Now, as the sun sets gently over the Nevada desert, silence returns to the sky, leaving behind only memories etched in scars visible and hidden alike. The story they lived might fade, but the lessons remain. The deepest wounds aren't always those we see, and redemption lies in confronting the past, not running from it. So, as we say goodbye, consider this: if the moment came, would you have done anything differently? Or is every scar earned simply another step toward becoming who you were meant to be?